Hello again. Today I'm going to be discussing oil painting again, and in particular the subject of glazing. I finished this grisaille of a horse portrait and now I'm ready to glaze colours over the top in several layers to ultimately achieve a full coloured oil painting with all the tones I wanted to create done so correctly, because I've done the grisaille underpainting before I've added the colours. The painting is completely touch dry at the moment. This is a really important point. I use alkyd mediums like Gambling's Galkyd and M-Grain's Walnut alkyd oils, which help my painting dry very quickly. Glazing requires the previous layer to be completely dry, or in oil painting we should probably say cured, as oil paintings don't dry as such like acrylics or watercolour paintings. The painting should not smudge or have paint come off onto your finger or a cloth if you touch the paint. That's essentially the level of dryness or cured that you want before you add a second or the layer of glaze that you wish to add. If you try to glaze over a layer when the paint isn't dry, it will no doubt mix with the layer below, and for what I do, that generally isn't desirable. So just a quick run through of the colours and the types of materials that I use when starting a glaze such as this. First of all, the paints that I'll be using. I use lots of different brands of oil paints, and I started painting with Winsor & Newton oils. They have Winton oils, water mixable oils, or artisan oils is the name, alkyd oils, which are called Griffin, or the Artist's Colours oils. I usually use the alkyd oils, or the Griffin oils, or the Artist's Colour oils. The Artist's Colour oils for Winsor & Newton are a really great quality paint, and because I'm mixing them with an alkyd medium such as Galkyd, I tend to use these a lot. I also use Michael Harding paints. These paints are probably the highest quality paints I've ever used. I've used most of the brands on the market, but the Michael Harding paints are a joy to use always. They have a buttery quality that is difficult to describe and easier just to feel when you use the paints. I'll do more videos in the future specifically about products and what I use and what I like. The colours I'll be using to glaze with this in the first glaze layer here are Winsor & Newton Burnt Umber, Winsor & Newton Van Dyke Brown, Winsor & Newton Titanium White, Michael Harding Raw Sienna, and Michael Harding Burnt Sienna. Now on to mediums. Here I'll be using a mixture of Gambling's Gamsol and Galkyd. I'll be following the principle of fat over lean, which means that as I paint the next layer, I will use progressively more oil or fat, to call it another name, or in this case Galkyd, which is the oil equivalent in my mix. When I started painting in the underpainting and the grisaille layers, the medium mix is leaner and has more Gamsol in it to thin the paint. By the time I'm glazing colours, I'm using a higher percentage of Galkyd in the mix, as I am here in this layer. Galkyd is an alkyd medium. This helps the painting to dry quickly. I usually find that a glaze layer, especially since the glaze layers are thin, tends to be touch dry in around 24 hours or even less. I also use tear off palettes. I use white palettes sometimes, or sometimes I use grey palettes to help me work out my tones, because sometimes when you mix colours on a white background it can be more difficult to see the right colour or tone, or at least I find sometimes it's easier to use grey palettes in this way. But here I'm using white palette and checking my colours are right as I apply them to my painting. I use a wide variety of brushes. I keep old brushes that are very worn, because sometimes that worn bristle can help with techniques in oils such as scumbling, and it might just be the right brush for what you need. Here I have two Pro Arty Filbert brushes, and I have another soft brush, which I may or may not use for this glaze. This brush is actually a soft makeup brush and is actually one of the better brushes that I own. I don't really care too much about brands in my materials, so long as they do a good job and sometimes cheaper materials and equipment actually do the best jobs. I tend to find that things like paints and the surface that you paint on are better to buy the more expensive brands, but with brushes I can find good brushes for cheap from time to time. Here I'm mixing some of the paints with the Gamsol and Galkid mix. I use a small plastic container, like a shot glass, to add a small amount of my mix, to which I then use to add to the paint in the quantity that I need. If I use a thinner mix of paint, if I want a thinner mix of paint, I just use more medium. You can separately mix mediums together, or you can just add the required amount with a dropper, or whatever way suits really. You can also mix required amount for each inch of paint that you extrude from a tube. It really depends on how technical you wish to be with this. I tend to try to strike a mix of technical and just using what I think makes sense. It is important to try to not overuse the mediums in painting. A quick note on paint tube information. When glazing, you're adding essentially transparent colour over the layers below. That is because you want some of you want the tones underneath the glaze you're about to lay to come through in some way, so that the lighter areas stay light, but just with your glaze over it, and vice versa for the shadow areas. You can make paints more loose to apply in a glaze by adding medium to aid the flow, but you also should be aware of whether the paint is transparent or opaque in quality. You can add opaque colour to glazing mixes also, but it all depends on the mix of transparent paint, opaque paint and medium. Each manufacturer of paint will have the information about lots of paint attributes on the tube of paint that you buy. So for example, in this image that I'm showing, you can see that the Michael Harding Raw Sienna is a semi-transparent paint, and the Winsor & Newton is an opaque paint. The Winsor & Newton tubes will have a filled-in square for opaque, like this titanium white tube of paint, and the square will not be filled in for transparent paints. It will have lines through for semi-transparent or semi-opaque paints. Different manufacturers have different ways of saying the same thing. Here I'm starting the first glaze onto my grisaille of the horse portrait that I've been working on. Glazing was a technique used by many of the old masters and results in creating depth and giving dimension to a painting. When you glaze, you're doing what is known as optically mixing the paint. That is to say, you are mixing paint in distinct layers as opposed to mixing the paint mechanically, although you can do both, of course. It is possible to achieve a great degree of depth and realism when glazing. It is a method of applying paint that I use most frequently. It's a way of blending tones and colours extremely effectively. You can glaze over a black and white underpainting, or you can glaze over other colours to add warmth or coolness, or to correct the tonal value. I like to paint in layers so that I can blend wet glazes of colour over dry layers so that the blending is much more easily achieved. I sometimes like to use what is known as a velatouras in my painting. This is also known as a half paste. This is when you apply the paint, in my case usually with white, to a dry underpainting, and the result appears as a fog. So you're essentially creating a cloudy fog, which can be helpful for many reasons, such as adjusting a tone slightly or making your colours have subtle highlighting using scumbling or other such brush techniques. Glazing allows transparent paint to be applied to allow the tone to show through, but to have the glazed colour take on that undertone. When I glaze, I start with what I'd call a saturated first glaze. You can glaze in many ways, but I tend to start with a base layer to get a feel for the colours over my grisaille. I know it won't be 100% correct on the first glaze layer, but I know that it will set the scene for future success. One thing to be aware of is that when you glaze layers of colour, the painting will also get darker. Therefore, you need to continually check your tonal values to see that you aren't losing what you had from your grisaille. Another point to make with glazing, is that especially on portraits of people and animals, the subject can oftentimes look sickly when you have applied the first glaze. This is because the glaze is still heavily showing the dead layer underpainting or grisaille through the glaze. With successive glazes you can change this and make the shadows and the colour correct. As I glaze paintings in several layers, anything from one layer to around 4 layers of glazed colour, I can add either one layer or up to 4 layers of glazed colour. You can add as many glazed layers as you wish, but I tend to work from around 1 to 4 layers. As I do this, I adhere to the fat over lean rule by applying more oil, in my case Galkid, to the mix that I'm using. Please enjoy the rest of this short video of me working on the first glazed layer of this portrait of a horse. Thanks for dropping by and happy painting.